Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. Today, we're going to talk about preventing and managing abiotic disorders of tomato. I'm the UK Extension Vegetable Specialist, and we'll just jump right in here. So, preparing this soil, we're going to talk about preparing the soil to avoid abiotic disorders, and then we're also going to talk about the tomato ripening disorder specifically. So what are they? What do they look like? What causes them? And really importantly, how can we prevent them? So the nutrient requirements for all plants are on this list, right? So macro and micro. And the crop nutritional requirements are the same regardless of whether you're a conventional or organic producer. So what changes, and this is important, is the source of the nutrients for that production system. So organic growers typically have less options for fertilizers, for example, compared to a conventional grower, right? But the actual requirements, the amount is the same. And so that NPK is still just as important one way or the other. Calcium, magnesium, sulfur, the other macronutrients. And then we also have this list of micronutrients. And so it's important that to remember that the micronutrients are not less important. Just they are required in a smaller concentration compared to macronutrients. Sometimes considerably smaller concentration, but very important. And if there's a deficiency in a micronutrient, typically it will show up in the plant, and a lot of times it shows up by the time the grower sees what that deficiency, that symptom, it's often really hard to change later on. And this goes not just for tomatoes, but for other vegetable crops as well. So a key component to prevention and management is knowing your soil. And how do we know our soil? How do we know what's going on there? And part of that is collecting a soil sample annually for testing. So for spring and summer production, you would want to collect the previous fall. And there's several reasons behind that. So one is if you go with the UK soil lab, right, they process a lot of samples. And so if you collect your soil sample in March and you're kind of in a hurry to get going and get the field prepped, a lot of other people have that same idea and there's a backlog, right? So you're waiting, and maybe because things take longer than you expected them to, you go ahead and do what you want to do without that soil report. And then after the fact, you learn, okay, oh, my pH is off. What am I going to do? Well, there's for soil pH adjustment, there's not a whole lot you can do post plant. Calcium or sulfur or lime need to be applied pre-plant in order to make the biggest impact. And additionally, they should be applied months prior to planting. So if you sample in the fall, get that report back, you're not in as much of a hurry, you can make those adjustments, you can make those additions. And then when spring comes, pretty much you're just focused on fertilizer, right? Applying that fertilizer, that pre-plant fertilizer, and getting the beds ready to go, right? So if you're a high tunnel producer, we're also requesting that you tack on that soluble salts test for your soil. And that's an additional $4. And so that's just a matter of you asking the agent to check that box, right? Or put the note on your sample that you would also like that included. So it's just learning or just requesting the soil test is not enough. You need to learn how to interpret the results of the soil test. And certainly your county agent or myself and others can help you learn what this means. And sometimes there's a lot of information there to sift through, and just learning how to read it and what it means for your system can be really important. These soil tests help you apply only the nutrients you need based on your soil, right? And the crop you intend to grow. So make sure you include what crop you're applying for, and what crop you plan to grow, and really dig down and read that report and make adjustments based off the recommendations. Another thing we typically advise is to do split applications of fertilizer, specifically nitrogen. Phosphorus and potassium are often applied pre-plant, and that is completely normal. They don't leach as readily, and there's not many options for water-soluble phosphorus and potassium, especially phosphorus. So doing those pre-plant is fine. But nitrogen, a lot of times there are options for water-soluble nitrogen, or you can side dress and just add the nitrogen as the crop needs it, right? So it doesn't take it all up at once. And ultimately, this can help people save money because they're not spending more on fertilizer than they really need. They're not applying more than they need. And you could look at it from another angle and say, maybe this is going to make me money because, okay, last year we had a lot of abiotic disorders. We had a lot of, which meant our tomatoes, there was a big chunk of our tomatoes that were unmarketable. And so we didn't get to sell them, right? They either went to the pigs, or we cut out the parts we didn't like and used the rest for canning, right? So there's a whole host of benefits to getting a soil test. A lot of it is about prevention and management of your crop. So pretty basic, we've all seen this before. Usually basically the takeaway here is you can use a shovel, you can use a trowel, you can use a soil probe, but you want to get a representative sample. And for vegetables, the depth at which you sample is usually about 8 inches, certainly no more than 12 inches. Just think about the root system of a vegetable crop and how, like a tomato crop specifically in this case, how deep does that go? It usually goes about 8 inches deep, right? So just make sure you collect a representative sample. In this case, I'm just using the tunnel as an example, maybe 10 different spots in a 30 by 96 tunnel, that'd be fine. Use a plastic bucket or a plastic bag, not a metal bucket. And the lab only needs about 2 cups, maybe less. And so the bags that we send in they have a line where it's like, do not overfill this bag, right? And so they mean it. We could send in a gallon of soil and they would only use 2 cups. So save the shipping costs and just, so you take a larger sample and then pare it down to about 2 cups. So this is an important component. So entering the crop to be grown, especially for tomatoes, it's important because we get this Hart's ratio. So for agents and growers, it's important to make sure you enter that information. Any information that you have is really useful, but this Hart's ratio will help you predict one of the problematic ripening disorders. So so here it gives a number 0.45, and so that doesn't mean much, right? But it gives an explanation, and I've cut it here. So if the ratio is less than 0.35, there's a greater chance that tomatoes will have ripening disorders such as yellow shoulder or blotchy ripening. So it's a ratio of potassium to magnesium. And so as you can imagine, if the magnesium is greater than the potassium, right, you are going to have a smaller ratio, and that could lead you to having one that's less than 0.35 in this case, and then may cause ripening disorders. So it does, for any time you enter tomato into the crops to be grown, it will give you a Hart's ratio. And so that's an important thing to remember. So here it is again. So you can see, right, this magnesium's 582 and the potassium's 166. So potassium's on the low end, and the magnesium's really, really high. So normally we'd say magnesium for tomatoes needs to be about 200 pounds per acre, and potassium needs to be somewhere between 200 and 300. So you can see this Hertz ratio is 0.14, and it's definitely less than 0.35. And so this particular person may be dealing with ripening disorders later on in the season. So, okay, what are those ripening disorders? What are they? Let's break it down here. So they're non-pathogenic, they're not infectious, right? They're not caused by an organism, bacteria, fungi, insect, right? So we call them abiotic. And they're also called physiological disorders. There's a lot of different names for it, but basically it's the plant's response to an environmental condition. So it could be extreme heat, it could be extreme moisture or humidity, it could be extreme drought, poor pollination, nutrient or soil imbalance, so too much or too little of something. It could be a combination of factors. And so it makes it extremely, in some cases, it makes it pretty challenging to really pinpoint the exact cause. And that's why having a soil sample or a soil test handy will at least help us narrow things down. So, okay, your nutrients look good, so that's not the problem. And then we'll go to the next possible issue, right? So, and then on another, so it could be many things, or the exact cause of many disorders is not really well understood. And so we're kind of left drawing some conclusions based off of the circumstances that the grower describes. So being as observant and accurate with what you've applied and when you applied it and that kind of thing can really help us narrow things down. So here's the examples of some tomato ripening disorders, right? Blossom end rot, everybody knows that, unfortunately. Yellow shoulder is also really common. Cracking, cat facing, white core, blotchy ripening, zippering. Those are all really common tomato disorders. So we'll start with blossom end rot, which is kind of the bane of everyone's existence. So especially in the midsummer when it gets really hot. So really it's characterized by dark brown or black sunken areas on the blossom end of fruit. So it's not just tomatoes, but it really can affect tomatoes frequently. A lot of solanaceous crops do get this. Lesions are a result of the lack of calcium in the blossom end of the fruit, right? So the calcium deficiency could be the cause, but most often it is water stress. So yes, technically there's a lack of calcium in the blossom end, but that doesn't mean that your soil is deficient in calcium, right? It just means that so it could mean that the calcium's there and it just cannot move to the fruit. So the plant, and typically when we see this, right, is in the summer when it's just so hot, we cannot supply the plant with enough water. So the plant does not have enough water to transport the calcium to the fruit, to the blossom end of the fruit, right? It may be in the plant tissue and it just cannot get moved to the fruit. So calcium moves through water conducting tissues. And so without proper water management, calcium cannot be transported sufficiently. And of course, when it gets really, really hot, even, the most careful grower may see some blossom end rot. So, as I said, extreme temperatures can cause water stress. Calcium is a positively charged ion, a cation. So other cations can compete with it for uptake. So, okay, it hasn't been particularly hot, but I'm seeing blossom end rot. I'm irrigating, what's going on, right? So if you've got, that's when we would say, all right, let's look at your soil test and look at these values for magnesium and potassium. And if you've applied a lot of nitrogen, what form is the nitrogen in? And then high soluble salt content in soil can also cause reduced uptake of calcium. So this would be more common in high tunnels, right, where we previously If any of you attended the high tunnel webinar, you heard me talk about soluble salts or high soluble salts in high tunnels. So without that leaching, a lot of the fertilizer can stay, a lot of the extra fertilizer, the extra salts can stay near the roots and build up and cause a salinity problem. So you probably would not, in Kentucky anyway, you would probably not experience soil salinity in the open field. The prevention, right? Let's conduct annual soil testing, right? So for a spring crop, sampling in the fall season before is recommended if possible. Avoid soil moisture fluctuation, so regular, consistent irrigation schedule. Don't soak the plant, right, and then let the soil almost get to completely dry, right? So keep it consistent, not too wet, not too dry, just a really consistent schedule. And then good soil drainage. So raised beds help with many factors of tomato production and plant production in general, but this can be something that helps water drain. And then also tomatoes just perform better in looser, lighter soil, so that bed formation kind of loosens things up a little bit, lets the roots form and spread out, and generally a healthier plant will result. So some other ideas, mulching. So mulching helps prevent soil temperature fluctuations. It can also prevent weeds that may compete for water and nutrients. So you do need to be careful about what type of mulch you use, where you source it. I'm sure Emily would have some things to say about potential disease development with mulching. She's shaking her head yes, so she can chime in later. So just be careful about where you source it and how much you put on. But if you repeatedly experience, soil temperature fluctuations or blossom end rot, it could be something that would help. Avoid high soluble salts in soil, right? So again, annual soil testing will help you regulate how much fertilizer you're putting on, because you're basing your fertilizer applications off of recommendations and what you currently have and what you need. So avoiding high rates of potassium and magnesium, and again, there's those recommendations there. So this is directly from ID 36, right? So here's the recommendations for phosphorus and potassium. And so we're shooting for the middle range here. More does not always mean better, right? Yellow shoulder, another really common ripening disorder. So basically it looks as if the tomato is going to, continue to ripen, like it just needs a few more days to turn red, and it just never turns red, right? So fruit is permanently discolored with green or yellow patches on the shoulders, the top part, kind of near the pedestal. So it looks unripe, but it will never change, right? It's caused by a heat injury or insufficient K. So insufficient potassium in the plant, not necessarily in the soil. Again, so here you may be noticing a pattern here. We've got possible multiple contributors to this disorder. So may have plenty of potassium in the soil, but it's not being taken up by the plant. Potassium is a cation and competes with other cations for plant uptake, and specifically magnesium and potassium often compete with one another. So when one is higher than the other in the soil, it gets preferentially taken up by the plant. So conduct your annual soil test, right? And it's going to tell you that Hart's ratio, and that's going to be a predictor, right, of whether you're at risk or not. Keeping plants as cool as possible during high temperatures. Orient the rows for best air circulation. So most people can tell me right off the bat, the wind blows from X direction. And so if you see yourself struggling with some ripening disorders year after year, and your rows aren't oriented, with the wind, that could be a consideration to make. If you're in a high tunnel or a greenhouse running the fans or installing fans, And then, of course, that consistent irrigation component. So it doesn't mean a lot of irrigation necessarily, but it does mean a consistent schedule. And so make sure your soil has adequate potassium before you plant. So phosphorus and potassium are two nutrients that it's much easier to apply them pre-plant than post-plant. We can get some potassium in there with potassium nitrate or potassium sulfate, but it's usually recommended to apply it pre-plant. So 200 to 300 pounds of actual K is needed in the soil per acre, I should say. That's a per acre. And then avoid over-fertilizing with magnesium. So those Epsom salts, that's magnesium sulfate. And so just be really cautious about how much you put down and only put down what you need. So again, here's this Hart's ratio example, right? And that ratio. And this is different based off your soil type. So this is specific for a Kentucky soil. So at a different, a different lab in a different state may give you a different ratio. Anything below this number, you're at risk, right? So again, it's usually caused by low K or at least lower potassium in relation to your magnesium. So maybe you have a lot of potassium, but you have more magnesium than potassium. You could still possibly have be at risk for yellow shoulder because it's a ratio of one nutrient to the other. Cracking. So radial or concentric cracking near the stem end or the shoulder of the tomato, right? So here's a really nice example. So those radial cracks are often caused by excessive moisture after a prolonged period. More common in open field than the high tunnel, right? Because at the high tunnel, we can regulate our moisture, right, with the cover. Concentric cracks, so those kind of circular cracks, are caused by water droplets hitting fruit from lack of foliage and then the sun hitting the water droplets. It's also it's also called weather checking. That's another name for it. And again, more common in open field than high tunnels. So again, because we have that protection in high tunnels from rain, from precipitation. So irrigate consistently to avoid those fluctuations in moisture. Cultivars, this is one of those cultivars can really vary in their susceptibility to cracking. So if you heirlooms can be more susceptible to that kind of thing. So if this is something that's affecting your sales or your marketability, you may want to consider switching tomato cultivars if it's a persistent issue. Maintaining healthy tomato foliage in order to protect your fruit, right, from the sun and from rain damage. That's also a preventative method. So making sure that you have adequate foliage before fruit set comes on, right? So again, there's a fine balance there, and I'm sure Emily can chime in on this too, of too much foliage, disease problems, not enough foliage, we get sunburned fruit, we get cracked fruit, we get weather checking, all that kind of thing. So too much foliage, also insect problems. So it's a fine line, fine balance. Again, following your soil test recommendations will get you on the right track to begin with. So keeping fruit dry if you can. So in the high tunnel, right, we would never recommend overhead watering for a tomato crop in the tunnel. Outside the tunnel, right, we can't change the weather, but certainly drip irrigation is recommended if at all possible. Okay, so cat facing. This is a distortion of the fruit at the blossom end. So fruit develops permanent scars, indentations that can extend the length of the fruit. And really this is the female flower parts may not develop normally during low temperatures when flowering. So if fruit has set or fruit's about to set, right, you've got flower, and the temperature drops kind of unexpectedly, you may see some of this. And again, I think this is also cultivar dependent. So extended cool periods may lead to cat facing. Daytime, 60 to 65, that's pretty cool for a tomato crop. Certainly one that's flowering. And nighttime, 50 to 60 degrees, that's also pretty cool for a tomato crop when it's about to, when it's flowering or about to flower. That would be pretty low. So prevention, right? Cultivars vary in their susceptibility. High tunnels, low tunnels, row covers will help keep temperature a little bit higher, certainly in the daytime. In the nighttime, a lot of these, there's only a few degrees difference between a tunnel and the outside, but it can help. And then early spring plantings, this probably isn't a surprise to anyone. Early spring plantings will be more at risk for this. So you've got those lower temperatures. You're trying to get ahead of the market. You're trying to be the first person with tomatoes at, you know, whatever market, but there is a risk there, and this is one of them. So you've got to kind of weigh the risk of damage versus the benefit of higher prices. So this is a really drastic example of cat facing. Sometimes it's not that bad, and sometimes you could still sell the fruit. It doesn't affect the flavor. And so kind of depending on your market and the expectations of your customers, maybe a little bit of cat facing is okay. And the same thing with cracking. Just depending on your market and who you're selling to, a little bit of cracking may not be a big deal for people. Gray wall. So grayish brown discoloration on the fruit. You can see it here, right? And it's developing here on the fruit wall. It may exhibit some internal browning. So it may look almost like a biotic disease, right? Because it can get kind of nasty. It usually appears on green fruit before ripening, so you can kind of see it developing if you're looking for it. So factors that may lead to gray wall: cloudy weather, wet, cool weather, high nitrogen fertility, low potassium, compacted soil. So you could see from you know, my standpoint, trying to figure out what the problem is can be kind of challenging. So when someone shows something like this to me, we're gonna kind of go down the list of, okay, what day were we, you know, what time of year is this? I'm gonna ask for a soil test result. You know, I wanna see that, and we're gonna talk about, you know, soil practices, soil prep, kind of talk about any potential compaction. So there's an example of, you know, the browning and just a generally poor looking fruit, and this will affect flavor. So this, the brown or the gray wall will not taste very good. So that would definitely affect marketability. So some prevention: consistent irrigation, again, proper fertilization. So definitely watch your nitrogen rates, and also make sure you've got the proper amount of potassium. So you need to be in that range of 200 to 300 pounds per acre. And consider cover cropping if you have compacted soil, and especially in a, you know, high tunnel, that compacted soil can develop because you're just using the same ground over and over again. So if you've got that time in your season, consider something that will help loosen the soil up. So adding a cover crop that'll loosen the soil up, add some organic matter. That's something to consider if your market, if your season allows it. Here's some sun scald. So occurs in the fruit exposed to direct sun in hot weather. Bleached or blistered areas develop in the fruit skin, right? So it looks pretty unappetizing. Excessive pruning can often be a cause of sun scald. Lower than optimal nitrogen rates. Too far away plant spacing, right? So the plants are too far away, and just fruits kind of naturally exposed just based off of where the fruit develops. And then preventing defoliating diseases. So those are all, anything that kind of, basically the point there is to try to maintain the right amount of vegetative tissue to protect the fruit, right? And so again, I will, this closer plant spacing, right, and too much foliage, right, there's a fine line there between we've got good fruit, we're protecting our fruit, and oh crap, we have disease problems because the plants are too bushy, right, or they're too close together, which often can be a problem in high tunnels where people really try to pack those plants in there, right? Sun scald would probably most often happen in the open field, just based off of management and maintenance and weathering and that kind of thing. But just be aware. Okay, zippering. So the presence of this brown tissue running down the side of the fruit from stem to blossom end, right? It's the result of the male portion of the flower, the anther, remaining attached to newly formed fruit. And so little prevention can be done. Cultivars vary in their susceptibility. Again, it's oftentimes an heirloom type that can be susceptible to this. And this is kind of along the same lines as cat facing or cracking. It really depends on your market. It won't really affect flavor. And so if people are okay with an unperfect fruit, then it's not necessary to completely trash these tomatoes or feed them to the pigs or whatever people want to do with their unmarketable fruit. It really depends on your market. But if it bothers you, it's most likely a cultivar issue. And so a lot of the new hybrids don't really have this issue. So this leaf roll of tomato, upward cupping of the leaf margin. So you can see here, it's kind of turned up right here. You kind of see a lot of it there. So the lower leaves are typically affected first. The rolling may eventually involve most of the plant. If it gets excessive, it can move pretty much up the entire plant. The rolled leaves feel a little rougher and a little kind of leathery to the touch. So the color looks generally okay and the size of the leaves look generally okay, but the leaves just are curled and a little rougher. Leaf roll symptoms can persist through the season. So particularly if those conditions kind of persist, and we'll talk about those conditions. Rolled leaves can sometimes recover if the environmental conditions and cultural factors are adjusted to reduce plant stress, but a lot of times once it's there, it's there. So plant growth and fruit yield and quality do not appear to be affected. So it's, from what I've noticed, and this, I would say this is the physiological disorder that I think is the least well understood. And they've done, yield and quality assessments. Several, lots of research has been done on that aspect, and that's why we're pretty able to safely say it shouldn't affect your yield or fruit quality. But there are several ideas as to what exactly causes leaf roll. So excessive pruning, a heavy fruit load, too heavy of a fruit load, those can kind of cause the leaves to roll, possibly. And also certain cultivars. From my perspective, certain cultivars seem to be more susceptible than others. So this one, there's not a lot of great answers, except, maybe the thing that will bring people the most comfort is to say, your yield and fruit quality probably won't be affected. So if you see this, it's not necessarily something to be alarmed about, but maybe observe your cultural practices, right? So did you apply enough fertilizer? Is there enough nutrition? how did you prune? If it wasn't you who did, you know, are there differences in the field or the tunnel? You know, did multiple people prune? Is there leaf roll on these plants versus these plants? You know, that kind of thing. So something to consider. So here's some resources. Of course, I referenced the vegetable production guide, the ID 36. ID 172 is great for abiotic, antibiotic causes, insect pests, the whole 9 yards. And then ID 235, if you're a high tunnel grower, a lot of what's in there is tomato related, not all of it, but a good deal of it.